Jacob! Hey, man.
Okay, please come in. Good morning, everybody. I'm the convener of this confirmation seminar this morning. My name is Brendan Weeks, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all for the confirmation seminar for Mr. David Wu. David is known to many of you, all of you, I think, as a research student in our faculty, and we're very pleased to hear from him this morning in his presentation regarding his proposed PhD work. I will convene the session, and we should ask David to probably finish speaking at 11, and then we'll take questions between 11 and 11:30. So, David, when you're ready, please begin.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for coming today, and hopefully this can be a journey into my research, and this will be a good feedback session because I want to know what I know about my research and what I don't know about my research. So to help with getting feedback, you could follow along. If you have a computer, you can go to my blog, and I've put this presentation on my blog. In addition, I've set up a back channel, so if you have any questions during the presentation, you can actually just put them here, and then we can address them later. I'm not using PowerPoint. I'm not even using Prezi. I'm using something else. And one of my cases actually showed me this. And it's a different way to present information. And hopefully it'll be more intuitive to follow than even PowerPoint. What I'm going to do is go clockwise through all of these mind maps. And I'll start with the title of my presentation, an overview, background information, some definitions, my literature review, the research significance and questions. Wait, what is that? Yeah, okay. My conceptual framework and my methodology, and I don't think we're going to get to the findings. All right. I like this software because it shows you the complexity of my research at this point, the kinds of things that I'm thinking about. And I want to spend most of the time on the methodology today and a bit on the literature review. So, the title of my seminar and my research is Changing Technologies and Changing Ecologies, Pedagogical Technologists in Schools. My name's David. Okay. And as I said before, I'll be going through these background definitions, literature review, etc. Okay, let's get to the background. All right. We are in a place in our society where we are becoming more aware of technology, the way we do things, because there are more ways of doing things being introduced into our society. And this touches all aspects of our lives. And it also touches, naturally, institutions such as education, schooling. So we have a lot of technologies, some of the more obvious ones we can see on our desks. Some of the less obvious ones, well, they're all around us. And as we are becoming more aware of how these things affect what we do, we have to consider how it changes teaching and learning. And people have written about how teaching and learning should change, how learning outcomes should change in view of new technology, new ways of doing. And ultimately, if there are changes to teaching and learning, which is what I argue a school's core technology, schools themselves must change. Okay, now let's get to my experience and this conference that I went to. Last year, around this time, I went to a conference. It's an educational technology conference. And there, I met some people who are helping to change schools through technology. And they are amazing people. I never met people like this before. They were not teachers in a traditional sense. They didn't have a timetable. They were not principals. They were not students. They were not technicians. Their primary responsibility was to support the pedagogical aspect of teaching through IT. And that was really weird. It was weird to meet them there, and it was curious to hear about their schools because their schools seemed to be very special too. One, because they had these roles. Two, they were sending these people to these conferences, they were subsidizing them. These people were going to this conference on a weekday. It sounded like I was in a different world. It appeared as if I was in a different world because I had been a teacher for 9 years, and although I had been an IT coordinator, I'd always been primarily a teacher. I never encountered this role before where this person was actually off a timetable and just supporting primarily the pedagogical aspect of teaching through IT. So that's how I got started on this research. I met some very special people, unique people. I didn't understand this world at all, this world that I'd stumbled into. Okay, a few definitions. I call these people pedagogical technologists. I made up this word. And as you will see later, there's a reason why I made up this word. It's actually a part of the problem about this role in schools, the nomenclature. So a pedagogical technologist is, again, not a teacher in a traditional sense. This person is not tethered to a particular year group or to a class or to a particular content area. The person's not a technician. Their primary responsibility is not supporting the technical aspect of teaching with IT. And just for comparison purposes, they are not like a principal role or a student role. Their primary responsibility is to support the pedagogical aspect of teaching through IT. Also, for the scope of my study, a school is discrete. Its core technology is teaching and learning, and in my study, they encompass primary and secondary levels of education, not tertiary. Okay. So I started to read. How do I conceptualize this phenomenon, these pedagogical technologists in schools? Well, I took it from two perspectives. One is from an organizational perspective, where this role is situated, and then I also looked at the role itself, the history of this role. Okay? So, looking at the pedagogical technologist more conceptually, I did some reading on technology. And for my study, and I realized after presenting this last week too, that it's important to have very clear definitions of these terms, because oftentimes when people talk about technology, they talk about completely different things, and then they end up with completely different conclusions. So to provide value for this word, technology is predisposed practice with a tool. It doesn't have to be a physical tool, it can be an abstract tool. All right? So for example, right now we're using a presentation technology. You guys are facing this way, I'm looking this way. There's a screen over here, a front and a back. And this is a particular way of doing, a predisposed way of doing. We know how to do this. So this is a particular type of technology. All right? So for my study, technology is more than the Apple logo. All right? It encompasses many ways of doing, predisposed ways of doing. Information technology is just a little different. We're dealing with information and communicating, creating, disseminating, storing, and managing information. Technologies that enable us to do that. Not necessarily computer-based. And then for my study, again, I use these words with and through technology, and these are very, very important. And I have to make a distinction between with and through. When we're doing something with technology, we're using technology and appropriating it to support something of traditional practice, a practice that already exists. For example, using an iPad as a remote control to control your PowerPoint it's with technology, teaching with technology. All right? You could actually just use a remote control, but you're just appropriating something new and just supporting a traditional practice. Through technology is using technology in a way to transform teaching and learning so that if you didn't have technology, you couldn't have this kind of pedagogy. For example, using this kind of presentation software enables us to see the complexity of my research and where the nodes are. Where is most of my thought going into in my research? And using PowerPoint, for example, you couldn't get that information across. So this would be an example of through technology. I'm doing something new and different that I couldn't do before. Okay. Let me move on to change. Again, this is a word that we can throw around so often, but it ends up being bankrupt if we don't have a very clear definition of what it is. Change is going from what is known to what is unknown, and it's marked by uncertainty and ambivalence. The kind of change that I'm working with in my study is technological change, which entails going from one way of doing, one technology, to another. And that's, that's technological change. Now, there's a lot of literature on change, and generally, when we see change as beneficial, it's called an innovation. That's the impression that I get from reading this literature. And people have identified success criteria for change. If change is to be successful and sustainable, these are some factors over here that are important for the change. Oops. Okay. Now I was looking at change in organizations, in particular schools. and I read a lot about organizational learning. And how do I envision organizational learning? It's how an organization reacts to or approaches change. And how do I envision organizations? Well, they're more complex than just an aggregate of individuals like this. We are not necessarily in this room an organization. In the same way, for an organization to learn or to react to or approach change is more than necessarily one person learning and then the organization learns. Scaling of learning from the individual level to an organizational level is complex. There are types of learning in an organization. When an organization does learn, it can be shallow, or it can be very deep. And generally, the learning only becomes deep when the organization challenges or transforms its beliefs, values, and assumptions. In reading about organizational learning in schools, these are important factors that affect the depth and sustainability of the learning. Then I started reading a bit about a particular type of approach to change, technological change in schools, IT integration. I was looking at different frameworks, and the literature presents many frameworks to position schools in terms of where they are in their IT integration process. And what can we learn from looking at these frameworks? Well, first, it seems like there are different categories and stages where we can place schools in terms of their IT integration. And IT integration encompasses new technology into infrastructure, curriculum, and professional organizational development. If we just take a look at these colors here, there are stages. And these stages in pink, they are more or less stable and static. Technology comes in generally in the form of infrastructure, but it doesn't really change things. There are computers in the school. That is about it. Ultimately, you start moving towards the yellow bits, where people start using the computers, and they're still using it to support traditional practice with technology. And then at the green parts over there, eventually there's this transition from appropriating technology to innovating with technology. And that comes of challenging beliefs, values, and assumptions about technology and pedagogy. Something that I kind of got from looking at all these frameworks is, although there are many stages, they're not necessarily linear in the long run. In addition, there's not necessarily a moral sense. It's not necessarily better to be in a green stage than a red stage or a yellow stage. Okay. Wow. Now, one way to view technological change in schools is to apply an ecological metaphor. This has been gaining traction in the literature. It's a way to explain technological change in schools in a way that people can understand, using metaphorical language borrowed from Ecologies. And there has been recently a lot of use of these metaphors in the literature. Okay. So I'm going to introduce some of the important terms. We can liken the environment, not only the physical, but like the cognitive environment, as an ecology. And there can be compounding ecologies. For example, Right now we are in this room and we're at this university, but within that we're also within a faculty. We're also within a city, Hong Kong. Within these ecologies, there are species, and they have different qualities. The literature puts out different qualities of species. They can be new species. For example, the literature often likes to cite like innovative pedagogical practices are an invasive species, and they are interacting with traditional pedagogical practices within a school ecology. There can be keystone species, very, very important species in a particular ecology, like teachers. All right? In a school, you really do need teachers. The literature cites other kinds of qualities of these species. They, how do I describe this? There are certain characteristics such as longevity, how long the species endures, fecundity, how quickly it can reproduce, and copy fidelity, how easily it can be copied. And the literature cites different kinds of species. All of these things can be considered species, and they interact with each other. And they can compete with each other, or they can cooperate with each other. Two other important things from my study terms include carrying capacity. The idea that within a certain ecology, it can only support a certain number of species based on its resources. For example, why don't we have, like, instead of like 1,000 postgraduate students, 10,000 postgraduate students? Right? Maybe this faculty in this university cannot support 10,000 postgraduate students for whatever reason. It doesn't have the carrying capacity to do this. Farming, the introduction of a new species, such as like a particular role, like an instructional designer, or the introduction of like a new innovative pedagogical practice through technology. You can introduce new species into the ecology, depending on the carrying capacity. Oh goodness. Sorry, I'm a little slow. All right. Okay. I want to go quickly through the other aspect of my literature review. So I'm conceptualizing this environment where the pedagogical technologist is. But I also want to actually take a look at the role itself. What can I find in the literature? What's important to know about this role? It was cool last week to meet this guy, Mishra. And what's important about pedagogical support for teaching through IT is actually being aware of the knowledge domains. And TPAC is a brilliant way, in fact, to conceptualize the types of knowledge that we need. We need technological knowledge, we need pedagogical knowledge, and we need content knowledge to successfully integrate technology into teaching and learning. I was reading a bit about instructional design too, which I believe is purpose teaching and learning with technology. We can view the pedagogical technologist role as within the discipline of instructional design. And then I started reading about the people. Specific pedagogical support for teaching through IT roles. What can we find in the literature? I found out, I read about IT coordinators, instructional designers, and learning technologists. And these are some of the important things that I found about these roles. Ultimately, none of them fit the pedagogical technologist description for my study, even IT coordinators, because in the literature, these people are primarily teachers, and then their pedagogical support role is ancillary. Also, they're primarily dealing with the technical aspect of teaching with IT. Learning technologists, these people are in the higher education setting. But what's important to know is that this role, like the pedagogical technologist role, is emergent and very, very ambiguous. From reading about instructional designers, we know that character also influences. The character of the person influences their work, as well as their interaction and experience. Okay, this is really important. This is actually a really big problem with my, I mean, it problematizes everything. The nomenclature of the pedagogical technologist. How do I find information about the pedagogical technologist when there are so many different job titles to describe what that person does? These are the job titles that I found last week when I was presenting at a conference that was attended by many pedagogical technologists. We have things like Learning Technology Advisor, Learning Technology Coordinator, ICT Curriculum Leader, Head of Learning Technologies, Digital Literacy Leader, Digital Literacy Coach, ICT Facilitator. We're dealing with bankrupt terms. These titles, these job titles, actually have no meaning. And that's a part of the problem. Because this role is emergent, we don't have a normalization of the job titles. We just can't say teacher and you understand. So finding literature on these job titles, you actually can't, because schools are just making up their own job titles because we don't actually have a very clear idea of what everyone's doing globally. In fact, all of my cases have different job titles. Okay. All right. Research significance. I presented this last week at a conference that was attended by practitioners, pedagogical technologists, and they want this research. Getting feedback from them, they also don't know what they're doing. Their schools don't really know what they're doing either, and that's a problem, especially when assigning value to what these people do. How much do we pay these people? And that was something that came across quite clearly in their feedback. They aren't necessarily working with a year group. They're not necessarily pushing papers. They're doing all sorts of things. How do you convey that to leadership and then assign a value to what they do in the school? The schools themselves also don't know how to assess these people. You know, it's easier to assess a teacher because you have a kind of clear idea what they do. They somehow work with students, certain types of students in a certain area. Right? But schools themselves are trying to formulate, how do we assign value to what these people do? The research is significant too because the more schools integrate technology, the more they have to consider pedagogical technologists in their schools. I met school leaders and also teachers who are transitioning now from having like a teacher, primarily teacher pedagogical support, to having a pedagogical technologist in their schools. And they don't really have a clear roadmap of what they're doing. It's just a fog right now for them. They're jumping into this vast ocean, and they don't really have a clear idea of what to expect. So there actually are a lot of schools that are transitioning into this pedagogical technologist role in their schools, and they don't really have a clear idea of what's going on. Additionally, now is actually an opportune time to do this research because my cases, the people I'm studying, as my findings suggest, are very, what's the word, like transient? They don't stick around. So that I was able to actually study these people right now, I think it has to be taken advantage of. Otherwise, they will go away, and then I cannot study them anymore. Okay, there are a lot of literature gaps, and I call them literature frontiers. we're at the edge of something, or at the beginning of something special. And in general, there isn't much literature on these people, these particular roles. And the body of literature on technological pedagogical change in schools is growing. And ultimately, we really don't know how these people, these pedagogical technologists, what their role is in technological pedagogical change in schools. And there's some other things here that are gaps within this idea that we have a role in a changing school. Okay, quickly. So I have some research objectives. Ultimately, I want to explore the major species that affect the pedagogical technologists' work in a school. I want to understand their qualities and the interactions between species that affect how the pedagogical technologist works in a school. I also want to identify success criteria for pedagogical technologists. This is very important. Schools want this, practitioners want this. What does a successful pedagogical technologist look like? This is my research question. How does a pedagogical technologist impact a school's ways of working with and through technology? Okay, conceptual framework. I'm using the ecological metaphor to understand the complex world of the pedagogical technologist. And I've borrowed from the literature in developing this framework. We have a pedagogical technologist, this role, this new species within a school ecology. And the ecology is populated by species such as teachers, principals, parents, policies, leadership, etc. It's important to mention that let's not view these species as people, but roles, particular technologies. All right, we're all people, but we occupy different roles. Right now I'm a presenter, I'm using presenter technology, but I'm also a student as well. So we're dealing here with the roles of people, not necessarily their humanity. And then I position the school as an organizational species within a global ecology with other schools, governments, community, professional organizations, and businesses. How did I come up with these species? I went through a literature review and developed certain important species that affect technological change in schools. And so this table is in fact just another way to visualize this, present this information. I modified this for the Hong Kong context because Hong Kong is a very special place. It doesn't have district or national layers. It's a state. And so the kind of external environment that the school operates in is a little different from schools that operate in nations. Okay, so I view this in terms of an ecology of the methodology. I'm going to use a qualitative multiple case study research approach. And I'm going to break this down for you. Why qualitative? Because the phenomenon is human, it's social, and it's complex. It's and then why case studies? Well, case studies enable me to study something in a context. No, how would I describe this? allow me to study a phenomenon that is not so easily taken out of its context. I'm studying something in situ. It's context bound. I can't actually study the pedagogical technologist without studying the school and global ecologies and where it works. I just can't study the pedagogical technologist by itself. I can't rip it out. Case studies development used for educational innovations. It encompasses multiple sources, and I can use theoretical propositions, such as my conceptual framework, to guide my study. Why multiple case studies? Why not just one? Well, I feel like every case is like a small experiment, a minor experiment to broaden the theory about pedagogical technologists, what we know about pedagogical technologists. It follows a replication logic, as Merriman says, or each case is instrumental, as Stake says. But every single case helps us to understand, broaden our knowledge about pedagogical technologists. All right, so if we have one case, we know this much. But if we have 5 cases, we know a bit more about pedagogical technologists. But I also say that each case by itself is intrinsic. It actually has a lot of learning value by itself. So each case, each of my 5 cases by itself, has a lot of learning value. Put them all together, and we can really deepen and broaden our understanding of pedagogical technologists in general. Now, it's important to note that I'm after analytical generalizations and not statistical generalizations. My objective is not to create a theory that can be applied to all pedagogical technologists around the world. I can't do that with a sample of 5. But what I can do is give you a range of possibilities of what a pedagogical technologist can be like. And then let's talk about the sample. It's purposeful. It's convenient. I can access my sample. I actually know my sample. And they're here in Hong Kong Island, in fact. And then that makes it easier for me to, well, do data collection, do data analysis. How else are they purposeful? I selected them based on balance and variety. That is, I don't want to show you the same thing, right? The exact same thing. I want to show you something that's similar, but just a little different, right? There's no use in presenting 5 cases of the exact same people in the exact same contexts, right? You need to actually create some variation there and then explain those differences. Okay. So there is balance and variety in terms of the people, the pedagogical technologists, and the organizations in which they work. For example, I'm dealing with 4 guys and 1 girl. I'm dealing with 3 international schools, 1 special designation international school, and 1 organization that controls international schools. Okay. But again, the extent to which there's balance and variety, in fact, is not known until after data collection. So at the start, I only have an impression of how much balance and variety there is in these cases, but then I only discover the extent of it after I'm done collecting data and I can make comparisons. Okay. How am I collecting data? I'm going to be interviewing these pedagogical technologists and people around the pedagogical technologist, the people that the pedagogical technologist interacts with. I'm going to be recording these interviews. I'm also observing them and taking notes. I'm taking photographs without people, and I'm analyzing documents as needed. Okay, this is the most important part. Here we go. Now, how am I going to go about collecting the data and analyzing the data? Where do I even start? And I'm grounding my data collection and analysis. And what does this mean? Right now I'm in an ocean. I don't know where the land is at first, but I have to start moving in a particular direction to get my bearings, and ultimately I may find land. At the beginning of this research, because it is exploratory, I actually don't know what I'm looking for. What kinds of qualities in these species, what kinds of interactions am I looking for? What's prominent? I actually don't know. I just actually have to go in there and start observing and sensing. And then, as I continue to do this in an iterative fashion, concepts start appearing. Patterns start appearing in interactions, in qualities of interactions, and qualities of species. And those are the things that I start to focus on in subsequent data collection instances. And I modify my data collection instruments, the episodes I select, the interview questions I ask, the people I want to see, to fit what I'm actually looking for. So once I start looking around, I start seeing certain things, and then I keep walking in that direction. So the grounding of the data collection analysis is based on primacy. What do I keep seeing? I mean, I can see so many things in this room, for example. But then I go to another room, and then I see some similar things. And then the next room, I start looking for those things that I keep seeing. So there's primacy involved in the concepts that I'm looking at. Some qualities will continue to appear, and then I'm going to keep looking for them. This isn't to say that the things that I see at the beginning, there's so many things that I could look at the beginning, it's a waste of time. It's not a waste of time. It helps me to acclimatize myself, to figure out the logistics of data collection, it also can be used for further research. But not everything that I collect, in fact, is going to be useful for my study ultimately. I'm just looking for some important concepts that I keep seeing within cases and between cases. It's important to note that this is not grounded theory. It's significantly different from grounded theory, in the sense that grounded theory is very, very prescriptive from the start. You have to do certain things. Go through certain coding patterns, for example. In addition, grounded theory doesn't rely on theoretical propositions from the start. I have some theoretical propositions. I have a conceptual framework that helps me to guide what I'm looking at. But as I continue to collect data and analyze data, I also start using that to inform what I'm looking at in further iterations of data collection. Okay, sorry. Finally, how do I know that what I'm looking at is in fact valid and reliable? How is this not just a piece of investigative journalism? Well, Yin lays out 4 types of validity and reliability measures. And the grounding of the data collection and analysis are important for establishing validity. The more I see something, the more likely it exists. The more likely this construct, this quality, in fact, exists. When I keep seeing it within a particular case, it becomes more likely internally valid. Between cases, it becomes more likely externally valid. It's applicable not only to this particular case, but to other things outside the case. So I'm looking for concepts, not only concepts, but concepts across data collection methods. So I hear something, a quality, during an interview, and then I see it in a document as well. This triangulation helps to establish validity. Member checking. Ultimately, when I have these concepts that I want to share in my research, I will have someone else take a look at the data as well and say, hey, can you code this for me? What kinds of things, according to these concepts, do you see here? I'm using, and reliability. I'm storing my data securely. I'm taking care of all of my data, and hopefully other people who come in, if they were to come in and to do this research, could somehow have the same results and findings. All right. Research design stages. Okay, maybe this is what I'm doing. This is how I envision what I'm doing right now. I've already prepared. I've reviewed literature. I've secured my sample. I understand my context. I've developed the research problem, questions, conceptual framework, and instruments. I'm collecting data right now in a grounded approach. So I'm collecting data, analyzing data, and then collecting data again, according to what I find. Ultimately, I'm going to have 5 cases and then a multi-case report. Okay, the data collection plan. In practical terms, what exactly am I doing? How do I even begin? What happened was I had initial interviews with my pedagogical technologists. I explained my research to them. And then we brainstormed for episodes where I could observe. What would be interesting for me to look into? And so we agree upon these things based on their opportunity for learning. And then, after these initial episodes, other things would pop up that would be interesting. All right? So there would be other opportunities to observe, other opportunities to interview, and then we'd go from there. Now, as I am grounding the data collection and analysis, initially I don't really know what's interesting. But the more I observe, interview, and collect data, the more I can articulate, why is this interesting? Why do I even want to see you interact with these people? So, ultimately, the pedagogical technologist and I were less random in selecting opportunities for learning, but more focused in selecting opportunities for learning. Like, I want to see you interact with these teachers, or I want to see you interacting with these students. Do you have an opportunity? Do you actually do that? And I was collecting data from July 2011, and I'm going to finish tomorrow. Let me show you ultimately what I've done.
David, we're running over time. I'm afraid we'll have to wind up.
Okay, yeah, this is my last my last thing. I'm sorry, my pacing is a bit off. Overall, I did this last night. You can see the number of observations I've made, interviews, and documents, and they vary. There's actually balance and variety in the data collection. And I've listed the dates, the cases, the methods, and the species that I see, only the organizational and role species that I see the pedagogical technologists interacting with. And again, the further I go along in this research, the more focused the episodes become and the species I want to see the pedagogical technologists interact with. Okay, that's it, I'm done.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Now we have time for some questions. Yes.
David, thank you very much for the talk. Actually, I'm quite curious about your view on the grounded theory, because as we know, grounded theory is widely incorporated in various qualitative research.
Yeah.
And just now, you criticize it as prescriptive and hierarchical from the very start. But because as I understand it, it is more or less like a spiral process where you begin from data collection and then you form certain conceptual constructs.
Yes.
And then you propose a proposition.
Yes.
And then you test it or whatever, and then you start from the data collection again.
Yeah.
So it seems to me more or less like a spiral process instead of a hierarchical process.
Well,
so could you please explain it a little bit?
sure. There actually is a coding hierarchy to grounded theory. There are actually 3 coding hierarchies that you have to go through, right? But in grounded theory, in grounding the data collection analysis, I don't necessarily have to follow this rigid coding hierarchy for grounded theory. In addition, I also have theoretical propositions going into the data collection, right? In grounded theory, you actually don't have theoretical propositions going into it, but as you continue to collect data and and start coding, then you start forming theoretical propositions, then you start testing those theoretical propositions.
And how about it prescriptive? Because actually we are, I don't know, because it sounds to me very descriptive, the theory. I mean,
Yeah.
grounded theory is pretty much descriptive. And just now you say it's prescriptive, and what do you mean by prescriptive?
That is, you have to do this kind of coding first. Which coding is it? I forget it's coding. Then you have to do axial coding, and then you have to do the final kind of coding in grounded theory. So you actually have 3 coding types. And you have to go through this layer, then this layer, and then this layer in grounded theory. Do you kind of understand what I'm saying? You have to go A to B to C in coding in grounded theory.
Okay, thank you, David, for your answer. Other questions? Yes, thank you.
So actually, I have a question about the way you interview people.
Yeah.
So just now you say there is a brainstorming to do and your case.
Yeah.
So that means before interview, you don't actually know what you're going to ask.
At the initial interviews, I would explain my research to them. And then they would start sharing things about what they do. And then they start sharing these things, and then the pedagogical technologist and I agree, hey, let's actually follow up on this. And then when we go to this episode, I observe, and I start noticing things. And I start hearing about other things that they do too. So as we go through that, then I have more things that I can ask the pedagogical technologist about this episode that I viewed, and then also about another follow-up episode. As I'm grounding the data collection and analysis, for example, I notice things about community, right? I'm like, oh, wow, these pedagogical technologists belong to a community. So then I can start asking questions about this community that I noticed in previous episodes. But I actually, at the start, didn't know that they belonged to a community. So I actually have to start collecting data first, and then getting this impression, and then following up on it to figure out, does this person actually belong to a community or does not belong to a community? So this is how what I observe initially informs what I ask later on. I ask about the connections that this person has with other people, if they have any connections at all, based on my impression that there is a community. But in fact, at the start of this data collection, I had no idea that this existed.
So what are your subclasses? I noticed there is only one broad subclass.
Yeah.
Now there's subclass.
Sub-question. What makes a pedagogical technologist, or what makes pedagogical technologists successful in today's schools? Ultimately, I will have more questions that I can answer through the data. And again, this is a part of grounding the data collection and analysis. I'm going to have a set of answers at the end in my findings. And then I can think, oh, well, what are the questions that we in fact answer? So right now, I have 2 things based on my objectives and the research significance. And then as I start exploring, I can add more sub-questions. Right? So again, there's so many ways to answer this primary research question. And I can't answer every single sub-question that exists, that possibly exists, through this main question. And that's why I start collecting data and analyzing data. And ultimately, I have these qualities of species and qualities of interactions that are very prominent and prime in my research, in my data. And then I can say, okay, well, I can answer this question in these ways. And those are my sub-questions.
Thank you, David. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm just wondering, do you observe any conflicts between the species in your case studies? Because as we could predict, because it is a technology innovation in the schools, there might be some conflicts between the traditional way
Yes.
of pedagogy and the new one.
Yeah, some of the conflicts I've noticed include conflicts actually between the pedagogical technologists and teachers. Certain teachers, not all teachers. It's actually, there's conflict there. I've noticed conflict in the curriculum, intra-species conflict. That is, for example, if we want to do this one thing in the curriculum, and we feel like it's really, really important, well, we can do it if there's a discrete time for it. But when it's actually, when you decentralize, for example, IT teaching, that means that all the cool things that you could do in that IT class have to be put into the broader curriculum, and they have to compete with other curriculum items for attention and time in teaching and learning. So there's a significant conflict there, right? Which curriculum items will get the most attention in teaching and learning? Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
One thing is that in a community approach about the technologists in pedagogy, you see the comparative analysis with the in the hospital, like doctor and nurse. Is there any community approach of this type of diversification, anti or cooperativeness amongst these teachers and the pedagogical technologists?
Yeah.
Because we have learned or we have an experience with the in a hospital or in a medical situation that when doctors and nurses have got some what should I say, they're very much attached to the work and the patient, very much aligned, but there are some mental setbacks with the nurses and doctors.
Yeah.
The same situation is here?
There's some kind of beneficial relationship.
Beneficial relationship, right?
Yeah, I've noticed in all of my cases that there are mutualistic, again, to use ecological terms, mutualistic relationships between the pedagogical technologist and then another person in the school. That is, the pedagogical technologist is not a lone ranger in the school, not a lone change agent in the school. For every Batman, there's a Robin. And there are these relationships in each case where the pedagogical technologist works more closely with one particular person than other people in facilitating technological pedagogical change. And within the school ecology, I've seen pedagogical technologists work very closely within a school with another pedagogical technologist, with the vice principal, with an ICT teacher, and a, how would I even describe this person? A pedagogical technologist helper. So these mutualistic relationships augment the pedagogical technologist's reach in the school. And this is actually a very important finding. That is, by yourself, you can only reach so many people. You can only see so many people. You can only field so many queries. But when you have a proxy, someone else that you work closely with who can serve as an intermediary, then more people can come to you through that person and ask questions, and then that person can talk to you, and you can talk to that person as well. Hi, Shannon.
Thank you for your presentation. So I was just wondering that the three coding procedures you mentioned is the open codings,
Yeah.
so codings and selecting codings,
Yeah.
right? So during the open coding stages, and I was wondering, like, were you just use the predefined codes or Google codes or just by the integrations of everything? So will you, yeah, so this is my question.
That's good. Thank you for reminding me. So it's open coding, and axial, and then selected. These is
So, yeah, so just my question is during the open one, right? So will you just focus on, will you just make use of some predefined codes or just the legal codes and try to extract some new one or something? So,
well, I'm actually not following that coding scheme because I'm not using grounded theory.
okay.
In a practical sense, what I was doing was, after every data collection instance, I would record the species that the pedagogical technologist was interacting with in that episode. In addition, I would write down 10 things, 10 qualities of species or interactions that I'd notice. And then, after several iterations, there'd be primacy. I would notice maybe some of these points more often than not in other data collection instances, and then I start looking for those things, and those start informing the other episodes that I look at, the people I want to see, the questions that I ask. And in doing that, I start establishing validity for these findings that these codes that are coming across in my research. So it's like a triangle, right? So I have all of these things that are competing with each other, all these possible codes, and then I start noticing a few more, and then I start selecting for these in my data collection and analysis, so ultimately it becomes more finalized and rigid. So ultimately, I know what I'm asking, I know what I'm looking for, I know exactly what I'm going to look for. Like tomorrow, I know exactly what I'm looking for.
Do you have any other questions today before we finish? I do have one question, David. What ethical issues do you think come up in your research? Have you thought through those and how will you address them?
There are significant ethical issues. Okay. One is anonymity. There are only so many pedagogical technologists in Hong Kong. And I haven't really figured out how I can guard their identities well. I mean, if I say that this guy works in a German international school, it's like, that's it. You know, in the same way that one of my cases said, you know, David, when you say that this guy, like, he works for an organization that controls 21 international schools, it's like, that's it. It's hard to keep these people's identities secure. And I haven't actually thought through very well how the extent to which I need to keep them secure, but also provide descriptive data. I need to provide a richly descriptive product. But the more I do that, the more I give things away. Ultimately, I'm more inclined to give things away because I feel like that's actually a part of my findings. That these research participants in general have been so helpful. In fact, that's actually what they do. They give things away. They give away technological, pedagogical beliefs, values, and assumptions and ideas. And they are so willing to contribute, and this is actually a part of, they actually don't want to be anonymous, if I could say that. But again, I'm balancing two worlds here, right? I'm balancing an academic world where I have to consider these ethical considerations, and I'm balancing this practitioner world where they aren't anonymous at all. They have significant online profiles. They have significant, they're high-profile people. I haven't struck a balance yet.
And how will you judge what's in the mind of these participants?
As regards to anonymity?
What stages that you need to leave these participants have particular attitudes and
Yes.
conditions? And people yourselves in their shoes,
Mm.
how do you verify that?
I do a lot of peer review. Participant review. So after every data collection instance, I feed back what I've transcribed and my codes, the things that I've discovered, to the participants. And then they can either, well, they have every right to disagree or to comment on these things. And so the feedback has been positive.
But if you decide to publish this work, can I have feedback from
Yes.
you?
I'm going to deliver my case reports to them. And if they don't want any data included, ultimately, because like I've been feeding back all the data collection instances, and I'm giving them every single opportunity to go through the data, to go through my summaries of what I've noticed in the data collection instances, to go through my analysis, and to provide feedback. I'm just giving them a lot of opportunities along the way to change anything or actually delete something. But again, this is the interesting thing, and this is a part of the finding, that they're fine with this. That's actually part of the pedagogical technologist role.
Okay. Well, I think we'll finish up there. Thank you very much. And thank you, David, for your answers to the questions in your presentation. Thank you. If I could ask you to leave the room now. Thank you very much.